Every Tuesday at exactly 4 in the afternoon, Julian walked into Terminal 4, set 2 passports on the counter, and asked for 2 first-class seats to Paris. He did this for 18 months. I stayed home and told myself a man who works this hard has earned a little mystery. Then one Tuesday I came to the airport to surprise him, and a young gate agent looked up, smiled at me like she already knew my face from somewhere, and said, "Mrs. Hayes, will your sister be joining you at the gate, or is she meeting you inside?" I did not have a sister. I had never bought a ticket to Paris in my life, and the woman standing 3 feet behind my husband was wearing my mother's pearl earrings. Eleanor Hayes kept her house the way she kept her ledgers, in perfect balance. She had spent 11 years as a compliance auditor for a mid-sized investment firm, and she carried that same discipline home with her, folding towels into thirds, paying bills 3 days before they were due, remembering which neighbor liked her coffee black and which one liked it sweet. Order was not a preference for Eleanor. It was armor. Her mother had raised her in a house where the lights sometimes got cut off, where a missed payment could mean a missed meal, and Eleanor had promised herself as a girl that when she grew up, nothing in her life would ever again be left to chance. Julian was the opposite kind of person, or at least that was the story he told about himself. He had grown up on his family's cattle land 2 hours outside the city, hauling feed before school and mending fences after it, and he liked to say that ranch work had taught him everything he needed to know about running a company. You fix what is broken before it spreads to the rest of the herd. He had built Hayes Meridian Development from a single renovated apartment building into a firm that now controlled office towers on 3 continents. He wore tailored suits now instead of work boots, but Eleanor had always loved the parts of him the suits could not smooth over, the calluses that never fully softened, the way he still checked the sky before he trusted a forecast. They had been married 9 years. For the first 7, Julian's travel had been unpredictable, the way business travel usually is. 3 days in Singapore 1 month, a week in London the next. Then, 18 months ago, the trips had settled into a pattern. Every Tuesday, without fail, Julian flew to Paris. He came home Thursday night, tired, quiet, smelling faintly of a cologne Eleanor did not recognize, and by Friday morning he was himself again, warm, funny, present at the dinner table, with real attention in his eyes. Eleanor noticed the pattern the way she noticed everything, early and precisely, and she did what she always did with uncomfortable facts. She filed them away and told herself a reasonable story to explain them. Paris meant a new hotel project, he said, a partnership with a French developer that required weekly check-ins during the build-out. She had no reason to think that was false, except for the small things that did not add up. A charge on the corporate card for a jewelry boutique on Rue Saint-Honoré that never showed up as a gift. A missed call from a number with a French country code, late on a Sunday night, that Julian silenced without looking at it. The way he had started keeping his phone face down on the nightstand, a habit he had never had before. "You work too much," she told him one Tuesday morning, tying his tie for him the way she had done since their first year of marriage, a small ritual that had outlasted the honeymoon phase and become something steadier. "Paris again. Paris again," he agreed, and kissed her forehead. "I'll make it up to you. I promise." She wanted to ask him what exactly he thought he owed her for. Instead, she smoothed his collar and told him to have a safe flight, because that was the deal they had made without ever saying it out loud. She would keep the house running and ask no uncomfortable questions, and he would keep providing the kind of life that made questions feel ungrateful. That night, unable to sleep, she opened his email on the shared family calendar, the one they had set up years ago to coordinate school events for her nephew and dinner reservations and dentist appointments. Every Tuesday for 18 months there was a calendar entry. Paris Q. It did not say what the Q stood for. It never had an agenda attached, never a project name, nothing but 2 letters that meant absolutely nothing to her, and everything she suspected to him. Their 9th anniversary fell on a Tuesday that year, and Eleanor decided, for the first time in 18 months, to stop waiting at home for the story to be handed to her. She would go to him instead. She packed an overnight bag, booked herself onto a coach seat on the same Paris flight without telling him, and told her assistant she was taking a personal day. She wanted to see his face when she showed up at the gate. She wanted more than that, to see the truth of Tuesday for herself, whatever shape it took. She arrived at Terminal 4 at 3:30, 30 minutes before Julian's usual check-in time, and found a table at the coffee counter with a clean view of the first-class line. She watched families roll suitcases past her, watched a father lift his daughter onto his shoulders so she could see the departure board, watched the ordinary rhythm of people leaving for somewhere else, and she felt, for a moment, foolish. Maybe there was nothing here. Maybe love, after 9 years, simply looked like 2 letters on a calendar and a husband who was tired on Thursdays. Then she saw him. Julian moved through the terminal, the way he moved through boardrooms, unhurried, certain, a man who had never once in his life worried about missing a flight. He wore the brown leather jacket she had bought him 3 winters ago, the one that had gone soft and lived in at the elbows, and under it a shirt she recognized, and for one warm second she let herself simply watch her husband cross a room the way she had watched him cross rooms since the day they met. Then a woman stepped up beside him. She was perhaps a few years younger than Eleanor, dark-haired, dressed simply but well, and she carried herself with the quiet caution of someone used to not being noticed. Julian did not touch her, did not look at her the way Eleanor had feared he might, but he stood close to her, the way you stand close to someone you are responsible for, and when the woman's boarding pass slipped from her hand, he caught it before it hit the floor without even glancing down. The reflex of long practice. Eleanor's coffee had gone cold in her hand. She walked toward the counter. The gate agent was young, new enough that she still checked her screen twice before speaking, and she smiled the automatic smile of someone trained to be pleasant to strangers. "Good afternoon, folks. Passports, please." She scanned Julian's passport, then reached for the second one already in his hand, and her eyes flicked between the screen and the woman beside him, with a flash of confusion that she covered quickly, professionally. "Mrs. Hayes, will your sister be joining you at the gate, or is she meeting you inside?" Eleanor, 3 feet away, heard her own name spoken to a stranger. Her name, given to another woman. "I don't have a sister," Eleanor said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Julian turned. Whatever color existed in his face left it in an instant. The woman beside him took one step back, the reflex of someone who had learned to make herself smaller when danger appeared. "Eleanor?" He said her name, like an apology and a warning at once. "What are you doing here?" "I was going to surprise you," she said. "For our anniversary. I bought a coach ticket on your flight." She looked at the woman, who had not run, had not looked away, was simply standing there, with an expression Eleanor could not read, something closer to grief than guilt. "Who is she?" "Julian." "Not here," he said. "Then where?" Eleanor said. "Because for 18 months I have watched you leave every Tuesday and come home every Thursday, and I have told myself a story about a hotel project in Paris that apparently does not exist, because a gate agent just called this woman your wife." The gate agent, mortified, had already turned to help the next passenger, but the line behind them had gone quiet, in that particular way a crowd goes quiet when it senses it is watching something real. Julian took Eleanor's elbow, gently, and steered her toward an empty gate 3 doors down, and the woman followed at a distance, close enough to hear, far enough to stay out of the conversation. "Her name is Marissa," Julian said, once they were alone enough. "And she is not who you think she is. I need you to trust me for 5 more minutes before you decide what kind of man I am." Eleanor had spent 11 years reading financial statements for the lie hidden inside a clean-looking number. She knew, better than most people, that the story a man tells you in a crisis is rarely the whole story. But she also knew her husband's face, every version of it, and this was not the face of someone caught in an affair. This face belonged to someone who had been carrying something heavy, alone, for a very long time, and had just been told he did not have to carry it alone anymore, whether he was ready or not. 5 minutes, she said, and then I want the truth. All of it. Julian did not give her the truth in 5 minutes. He gave her a name, An old one, from before they had met. Marissa was married to my brother, he said. Eleanor had never met Julian's brother. She knew only the outline of him, the way you know the outline of any story someone tells you once and never returns to. An older brother named Thomas, 3 years gone, dead in what Julian had always called a boating accident on a lake near the family ranch. Julian rarely spoke of him, and when he did, his voice took on a flatness Eleanor had learned not to push against. "You told me he drowned," Eleanor said. "That's what the report said." Julian's jaw worked. "I didn't believe it then. I believe it even less now." He did not explain further that day. He put Marissa on her flight alone, told the gate agent there had been a family emergency, and drove Eleanor home in a silence so heavy it filled the car like weather. It was not until that night, at their kitchen table, with the anniversary dinner reservation they never made sitting unused on both their phones, that Julian finally opened the drawer of the story he had kept locked for 3 years. Thomas had been the older brother, the one meant to inherit the ranch and, later, half of Hayes Meridian when their father folded the family land into the company's first real estate fund. Thomas had also been the brother who trusted people too easily, who had let his business partner, a smooth, well-connected man named Richard Voss, handle the fund's paperwork because Thomas hated paperwork, and Voss seemed to love it. When Thomas died, 3 weeks after raising concerns to Julian about missing money in the fund's accounts, the death was ruled an accident within 4 days. No inquest, no real investigation. Voss had been the one to identify the body. "I asked for an independent review," Julian said. "Voss called it grief-talking. My father called it grief-talking. I let it go because I didn't have proof, and because I had a company to run, and Marissa was pregnant and terrified, and had nowhere else to turn. I've been keeping her safe since, moving her every few months. Paris was supposed to be the last stop, a place far enough from Voss's reach that she could finally stop looking over her shoulder. For 18 months, Eleanor said, you let me think you were having an affair. I let you think a lot of things I'm not proud of, Julian said. I told myself I was protecting you by keeping you out of it. The truth is, I was protecting myself. If Voss found out you knew anything, he'd have a second person to come after. Eleanor sat with that for a long moment. She was an auditor. She had spent her career finding the places where numbers did not tell the truth, and some old, disciplined part of her brain was already doing the math on what Julian had just told her. A dead brother, a missing fund, a business partner who controlled the paperwork, a widow in hiding. It was not romantic betrayal. It was something colder, and in its own way more dangerous. Show me the fund documents, she said. Everything Thomas flagged before he died. If Voss did what you think he did, there will be a trail. There is always a trail. People like that never clean up as well as they think they do. It took Julian 2 days to unlock the old storage unit where he had kept Thomas's things since the funeral, boxes he had never had the stomach to sort through properly. Eleanor sorted through them with him this time, and what they found, spread across the kitchen table under the same light where they had eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners, was a slow-motion picture of a theft. Thomas had kept a private notebook, handwritten, the old-fashioned habit of someone who had never fully trusted computers. In it were dates, wire transfer amounts, and a phrase repeated in the margins with growing alarm, reconcile with Voss. Eleanor recognized the pattern immediately, the kind of thing she had flagged a dozen times in her own career and never once been thanked for flagging. Small amounts moved out of the development fund into a holding account registered under a name that was not Hayes Meridian and not Voss's either, a shell company called Ashford Capital Partners, with an address that, when Eleanor searched it, turned out to be a mailbox rental store 2 towns over. This is textbook, she told Julian, spreading 3 years of bank statements across the table, like a woman finally allowed to do the job she had trained for her whole life. Small transfers, under the audit threshold, moved just often enough to look like operating expenses. Whoever did this either learned compliance procedures specifically to avoid it, or had someone inside a firm like mine walk them through the blind spots. Julian went very still. Voss's daughter works in compliance, he said slowly, at a firm downtown. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. Which firm? I don't know the name. Why? Because, Eleanor said, if it's mine, I need you to tell me right now, before I go into work tomorrow, and hand my badge to someone who has been laundering money through a fund my husband's family built. It was not her firm, as it turned out, a small mercy that let Eleanor breathe again. But the discovery changed something in her, sharpened her the way a real threat always sharpened people who had spent their lives keeping things orderly. She was no longer a wife trying to understand her husband's secret. She was an auditor who had found a case. And the case happened to involve the man she loved. They worked past midnight, cross-referencing Thomas's notebook against the digital records Julian still had access to as a Hayes Meridian board member. By 1 in the morning, they had traced 11 transfers totaling just under $4 million, all moved in the 14 months before Thomas's death, all funneled through Ashford Capital, and from there, into 2 accounts in Voss's name. He killed my brother over $4 million, Julian said quietly, staring at the numbers as though they might rearrange themselves into something less true. We don't know that yet, Eleanor said, though she did not fully believe her own caution. We know he stole from him. We know Thomas was about to expose it. We know Voss controlled the official story of how he died. That is not proof of murder, but it is more than enough to reopen an investigation if we bring it to the right people, in the right order, without tipping him off first. Before they went to the authorities, Eleanor insisted on one more conversation, with the one person still alive who had worked closely enough with both Thomas and Voss to know which version of the story was true. Julian's longtime executive assistant, a soft-spoken woman named Priya, who had been with the family company since Thomas ran it, agreed to meet them at a diner 3 exits from the office, somewhere Voss's people would never think to look. Priya arrived nervous, glancing at the door twice before she sat, and did not touch her coffee for the first 10 minutes of the conversation. Eleanor recognized the posture. It was the posture of someone who had been carrying a secret so long it had become part of how they held their shoulders. I should have said something 3 years ago, Priya said finally. I typed some of those transfer memos myself. Voss told me they were reimbursements for a land parcel that fell through. I didn't ask questions, because asking questions at that company got you moved to a smaller office, or eventually, out the door entirely. She looked at Julian. Your brother started asking questions. That's the part I never told you. 2 weeks before he died, he asked me to pull every wire authorization from the last year. He said something felt wrong. He said it to me exactly like that. Something feels wrong, Priya, and I don't know who else to trust with it yet. Why didn't you come to me after he died? Julian asked, not unkindly, but with the weight of 3 lost years behind the question. Because Voss told everyone Thomas had been struggling, Priya said. Money problems at home, drinking, the kind of story that makes a strange death sound sad instead of suspicious. I believed it, at first, because grief makes people believe convenient things. It wasn't until Marissa disappeared a few months later that I started wondering what I had actually helped bury. Eleanor, listening with the same careful stillness she used when a witness at work was about to give her the one detail that cracked a case open, asked the question she had been saving. Does Voss know Marissa is alive? I don't think so, Priya said. He told the board she'd left the country out of grief and cut off contact. I always assumed that was true, until I saw a security memo 2 weeks ago, forwarded to Voss's office, flagging unusual passport activity under a name close to hers. If he's looking, Mr. Hayes, he is closer than you think. They left the diner with more than they had walked in with. A witness willing to testify, confirmation that Thomas had suspected Voss before he died, and a new, urgent fear that the 4-year hiding game Julian had been running to protect Marissa was about to end whether they were ready or not. If you have made it this far, tap that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I would love to say hello to you personally while we find out together how far this story is going to go. Julian wanted to go to the police that week. Eleanor talked him out of it, not because she doubted the evidence, but because she had spent 11 years learning what happens to a case built on suspicion instead of proof. It gets quietly closed by people with better lawyers than the truth. "We need Voss to reach for Marissa himself," she said, on record. "If he moves against her while we're watching, that's not a 3-year-old boating accident anymore. That's an active threat we can put in front of a federal prosecutor, with dates and timestamps attached." It was Eleanor's training, not Julian's instinct, that shaped the trap. She knew from her compliance work exactly how fraud investigators built a paper trail strong enough to survive a defense attorney's scrutiny, and she applied the same discipline here. They let it be known, quietly, through a single carefully chosen source close to the company, that Marissa had resurfaced and was staying with family in Paris, under a name Voss's people were likely to eventually find. It was a risk. It meant using Marissa as bait, a decision Eleanor did not make lightly, and would not make at all without Marissa's full agreement. Marissa agreed without hesitation. "I have spent 3 years being someone's secret," she told Eleanor over a video call, her voice steady in a way that surprised Eleanor more than anything else about her. "I would rather be in danger for 1 more week and finally free than safe for 1 more decade and still hidden." While Marissa's location rumor moved through the company's back channels, Eleanor and Julian built a second, quieter trap. Julian, still a board member with dormant access to certain shared financial systems, flagged an old audit trigger on the Ashford Capital account, the digital equivalent of leaving a light on in a room someone thought was dark. If Voss checked that account, even once, it would leave a timestamp. And 3 days after the rumor about Marissa began circulating, the timestamp appeared. Voss had logged into an account he was not supposed to still have access to at 11 at night, checking whether $4 million in stolen funds were still safely hidden before, Eleanor suspected, he tried to move them somewhere no one could ever trace again. "He's rattled," Eleanor said, watching the log entry glow on her laptop screen at midnight, feeling something close to the satisfaction of closing a difficult audit. "Rattled people make mistakes. We just need 1 more." The mistake came 4 days later, and it was bigger than either of them had prepared for. A private investigator, hired anonymously but paid, Eleanor's research would later confirm, from an Ashford Capital account, was caught on a Paris apartment building's security camera photographing Marissa's building. Marissa, warned in advance and moved to a safe location Julian had arranged years before for exactly this possibility, was never in danger. But the footage, quietly obtained by a security contact Julian trusted, gave them something they had not had before: direct, current evidence connecting Voss's stolen funds to active surveillance of Thomas's widow, 3 years after her supposed disappearance. It was Priya, still working inside the company and feeding them careful, deniable scraps of information, who delivered the next piece. Voss had scheduled an emergency call with Hayes Meridian's outside counsel. The kind of call, Priya said, that companies only make when someone is trying to get ahead of a story before it breaks. "He's not just protecting the money anymore," Priya warned Julian over an encrypted message. "I think he's building a story where you're the villain. Something about board irregularities under your signature. He's setting up a frame before you can set up your case." Eleanor read the message twice. It confirmed something that had been sitting uneasily in her mind since the diner conversation. Voss was not a man who panicked. He was a man who had spent 3 years successfully rewriting a death into an accident, and a missing widow into a grieving disappearance. He would not simply run. He would try to control the ending of this story, the way he had controlled the ending of Thomas's. "If he's building a frame," Eleanor said, "he needs a scapegoat with access, motive, and no alibi. That's you, Julian. Board member, brother, next in line for exactly what Thomas controlled." "Then we stop being patient," Julian said. "We take what we have to the authorities now, before he finishes writing his version first." The warning arrived the next morning, before they had even made it to the federal building. A plain envelope hand-delivered to their front door. No return address, No note explaining who had sent it. Inside was a single printed page, a summary of a federal financial crimes inquiry already underway, referencing the Ashford capital transfers, the falsified reimbursement memos, and, buried in the third paragraph, a line that stopped Eleanor's breath in her chest. Investigators had also flagged irregular activity connected to Eleanor Hayes' compliance credentials, following an anonymous tip suggesting she had assisted in structuring the disputed transfers. "He's trying to frame me," Eleanor said, reading it a second time to make sure she had not misunderstood. "Not just Julian. Me too. He's using my own profession against me." It was, she realized with the cold clarity of someone finally seeing a plan in full, an almost elegant piece of cruelty. Voss could not undo what they had uncovered, but he could still control who took the fall for it. A husband with motive and a wife with the exact professional skill set to hide financial fraud made a far more convenient villain to a jury and to a company's shareholders than a well-connected executive with 3 years of carefully constructed alibis. Julian wanted to call his lawyer immediately. Eleanor, hands shaking but voice level, made him wait 5 minutes while she read the document a third time, hunting for the detail that would tell her who had actually sent it. She found it in the letterhead formatting, a font choice used almost exclusively by one specific federal division, and a case number format that matched investigations still in the pre-indictment stage, not yet public. "This didn't come from Voss," she said slowly. "Voss wouldn't warn us. This came from inside the investigation. Someone wants us to know what Voss is planning to say about us before he says it, so we can get ahead of it." Who would do that? Eleanor thought of the diner, of Priya's nervous hands around her coffee cup, of a woman who had spent 3 years quietly regretting her own silence. But when she called Priya that afternoon, Priya swore it had not been her, and something in her voice told Eleanor she was telling the truth. Which left only one other person inside the company with access to that level of pre-indictment information, and a reason to want Voss caught before Voss could finish framing someone else for his own crime. A business partner of Voss's own. Someone close enough to the fraud to fear prosecution, and desperate enough to sacrifice Voss first in exchange for their own protection. "Someone inside his own circle is turning on him," Eleanor said, "which means we're no longer the only threat Voss is worried about tonight." Voss made his move on a Tuesday, the same day of the week that had once meant nothing more complicated to Eleanor than a lonely dinner and an unanswered question. He arranged to meet Julian at the Hayes Meridian Executive Lounge inside Terminal 4, the same terminal where this entire story had cracked open months before, claiming he wanted to settle things privately, quietly, like reasonable men, before the federal investigators finished building their case. Eleanor did not stay home this time. She came with Julian, printed copies of the transfer records in a folder under her arm, because she had learned by now that reasonable men did not need private meetings to settle anything, and because she was done being the person waiting outside a room while other people decided the shape of her life. Rain hammered the terminal's glass ceiling as they walked in, the kind of storm that grounded flights and filled the departure boards with red delay notices. Voss was already seated, composed, a man who had spent 3 years believing his own careful story so completely that he had almost stopped fearing the truth underneath it. He did not expect Eleanor. His expression flickered, just slightly, when he saw the folder in her hands. "Eleanor," he said, recovering his smile quickly. "I didn't realize compliance officers made house calls. I didn't realize murder needed a business partner to cover the paperwork," Eleanor said, and set the folder on the table between them. "Ashford Capital, 11 transfers, Thomas's notebook, a private investigator paid from an account with your name on the incorporation documents, a federal case number that already has your initials attached to it, whether or not you finish this conversation politely." Voss's composure did not break so much as it recalculated, the way Eleanor imagined a man's face might look while he mentally reran every safeguard he thought he had built and found each one at a time, already gone. "You have no idea what you're accusing me of," he said. "I have exactly the idea," Eleanor said. I've spent 11 years finding the version of a story that the clean numbers are hiding. Yours has been hiding for 3 years. It's done hiding tonight." It was at that moment, as Voss's hand moved toward the inside of his jacket, not for a weapon, Eleanor would realize later, but for a phone, that the departure boards behind them all flickered at once. Julian had arranged it in advance with Hayes Meridian's own security team, working alongside the federal agents Priya's information had ultimately led them to. The moment Voss's name appeared on the terminal's internal network attempting to access flight records, every linked account frozen simultaneously, live, on the public screens above the gates. Hold flashed beside 3 separate reservations under names Eleanor now recognized from Ashford Capital's shell documentation. Federal agents, who had been waiting 2 gates down for exactly this confirmation, moved in before Voss finished dialing whoever he had been about to call. Eleanor watched, folder still in her hands, as the man who had rewritten her husband's brother's death into an accident and her own reputation into a lie was walked out through the same terminal doors where a gate agent had once, accidentally, told her the truth before anyone else was ready to. The federal case took another 4 months to fully resolve. Voss was charged with fraud, obstruction, and, eventually, once forensic accountants completed a deeper review of the Lake report from 3 years earlier, with a charge connected directly to Thomas's death. Priya testified. Marissa testified, no longer hiding, no longer a ghost carried quietly from one safe apartment to the next. Hayes Meridian survived the scandal, restructured under new independent oversight that Eleanor herself helped design. Because if there was one thing 3 years of theft had taught the company, it was that trust without verification was simply an invitation. Eleanor's own name was cleared within the first 2 weeks. The anonymous tip against her traced back to Voss's own communications, one more thread in a case that eventually held nothing but his fingerprints. On the first Tuesday after the trial ended, Julian came home early, and instead of a suitcase, he brought 2 boarding passes to the kitchen table, laid them down the way he once might have laid down bad news, except this time his face held nothing but a careful, hopeful kind of light. "Paris," he said. "Together this time. No secrets. No calendar entries with initials on them. Just us." Eleanor looked at the tickets for a long moment. She thought about the woman she had been 18 months ago, folding towels into thirds and telling herself a reasonable story to explain an unreasonable silence, because a comfortable life had once felt safer to protect than an uncomfortable truth. She was not that woman anymore. She had learned, the hard way, that the safest kind of love was not the one with no questions in it. It was the one that could survive every question being asked out loud. "Together," she said, and reached for the ticket with her own name printed correctly on it. No confusion, no stranger wearing her identity at a gate, nothing left to explain to anyone. They flew out that Tuesday, side by side, and somewhere over the ocean, Eleanor finally let herself stop auditing the marriage for hidden discrepancies and simply let it be what it had become: tested, honest, and for the first time in a year and a half, entirely hers to trust. If this story kept you here until the very last word, that means something to me. Subscribe so you don't miss what I'm telling next, and comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I read every comment myself, and I would genuinely love to say hello to you and hear how far this story traveled to reach you.